A devoted nun returns home after her father's death, only to face an unexpected burden: her troubled teenage nephew. As they navigate grief and isolation, an unsettling attraction begins to take hold. But how far will this forbidden desire go before it crosses the line? At the beginning of the story, we see a 40-year-old woman named Josefina, who is a nun and in charge of a girls' hostel. While at the hostel, she receives a call informing her of her father's death in the village. She also learns that her sister's 15-year-old son Alexandre is now alone. Alexandre had been living with his maternal grandfather because his mother abandoned him in childhood. Josefina, who dedicated her life to being a nun, now faces a huge responsibility to take care of her nephew. She decides to leave her life as a nun and resigns from her job at the hostel. That night, she prays to God and looks at an old childhood photo of Alexandre. The next day, Josefina takes a train to her village and attends her father's funeral. There, she meets her nephew, Alexandre, who is devastated by his grandfather's passing. Alexandre never received his mother's love, nor did he have a father or siblings, only his grandfather, who cared for him. But now even he is gone. Alexandre now has to live with his aunt Josefina, whom he barely knows. That night, Josefina brings tea and biscuits for Alexandre, but he refuses to eat. She tells him they must live together, so he shouldn't make things difficult. Hearing this, Alexandre starts drinking tea. Meanwhile, Josefina notices Alexandre has an injury on his foot. She takes him to the bathroom and cleans his wound. While doing so, she realizes that Alexandre hasn't bathed for many days and his body has a strong odor. Josefina helps him clean himself properly. Afterward, she takes him to his room and puts him to bed. The next day, a woman from an NGO visits. She tells Josefina that if she cannot care for Alexandre, they can send him to a care center where a good family might adopt him. But Josefina assures her that she will take care of Alexandre herself. Later, Alexandre asks about the woman and says, "I don't want to go to the care center." Josefina replies, "We will talk about it later." However, she feels conflicted. She wonders if sending Alexandre to the NGO would be better for him, as he might get a loving family. But she also fears he might not be happy there and feels guilty about the idea. These thoughts trouble her deeply. One day, Alexandre skips school and goes to his friend's house without informing Josefina. When she finds out, she gets very upset with him. That night, as Josefina is sleeping, Alexandre comes to her room. He tells her he had a bad dream and, out of fear, wet his bed. He asks if he can sleep with her. Josefina hesitates, not wanting him in her bed, but seeing his distress, she allows him to stay. The next morning, while praying, Josefina feels troubled by her emotions. She asks God for guidance, as she is deeply religious and wants to do the right thing. Later, when Alexandre comes home from school, Josefina notices his dirty feet and decides to help him clean up. She tells him, "We will go to the doctor tomorrow." At night, Josefina starts having distressing thoughts about Alexandre. These thoughts consume her, making her uncomfortable. To cope, she ties a metal wire around her leg, causing herself discomfort. Whenever such negative thoughts arise, she does this to refocus her mind. Josefina prays to God and asks for guidance regarding the thoughts she had while bathing Alexandre. The next day, she takes Alexandre to the doctor. After examining him, the doctor prescribes some medicines and they return home. Josefina takes good care of Alexandre, which he begins to appreciate. The next day, Josefina has to go to the city for work but cannot leave Alexandre alone, so she takes him along. They travel by train to the hostel where she used to work. There, she meets the other nuns and confides in her senior about her struggles. The senior nun advises her, "I understand that after your father's passing, you had to take responsibility for Alexandre, but don't be discouraged. Keep praying and learn to control your emotions. I know it's not easy." After this conversation, Josefina returns to her hometown with Alexandre. That night, while sleeping, Alexandre asks Josefina if she can rub his back until he falls asleep. She agrees and starts rubbing his back, but soon begins to feel uneasy. Alexandre eventually falls asleep, and Josefina unintentionally falls asleep beside him. The next morning, when Josefina wakes up, she finds herself lying next to Alexandre. Feeling ashamed, she gets upset with herself. Despite her guilt, she struggles to distance herself from him. Over time, she realizes her emotions for Alexandre are becoming complicated. Having spent her life as a nun, Josefina had never experienced such emotions before. However, since living with Alexandre, she has begun to have unfamiliar feelings she finds difficult to control. One day, she receives a phone call informing her that Alexandre's mother, her own sister, is coming home the next day. She now wants to take her son with her. This news distresses Josefina. She calls a lawyer and asks whether Alexandre's mother has the right to take him. The lawyer tells her that if Alexandre wishes to go, no one can stop him. Josefina does not want him to leave, as his mother abandoned him years ago. Trying to keep Alexandre close, Josefina takes him out for a walk and shopping, hoping that when his mother arrives, he will choose to stay with her instead. The next day, Alexandre's mother arrives and asks about her son. Josefina tells her that Alexandre is at school. His mother explains, "I had no choice but to leave him before, but now I have divorced my husband and remarried. My life is stable, and I want to take my son back with me." She gives Josefina her contact card and says, "When Alexandre returns, tell him to call me." After that, she leaves with her new husband. Later, when Alexandre returns from school, Josefina does not inform him that his mother came or that she left her contact information. That night, while Alexandre is asleep, Josefina watches over him with tears in her eyes. She places her hand near his feet and silently weeps. The next morning, when Alexandre's school van arrives, Josefina deliberately does not wake him up. She fears that if he goes to school, his mother might meet him there. When Alexandre finally wakes up and realizes he missed school, he gets upset. Frustrated, he tells Josefina, "I had a football match today. I needed to be there." He then insists on going by bus. Josefina refuses to let him go alone. Annoyed, Alexandre says, "If you're so worried about me, why don't you just buy me a phone?" Later, Alexandre goes to school by bus, plays football, and after the match talks to a girl he likes. Josefina also attends the match and notices Alexandre talking to the girl. On their way home, Josefina gives Alexandre a phone, which makes him very happy. The next day, Alexandre's mother visits his school and finally meets him. She tells him about her situation and explains why she had to leave him. They talk for a long time and she introduces him to her husband. The three of them then have lunch together. His mother expresses her desire for him to live with her now. She tells him, "A few days ago, I came to your house, but you weren't there. I left my number, but you never called." After lunch, Alexandre's mother drops him home. That night, Alexandre reflects on whether he should go with his mother. He takes out an old photo album, but realizes there isn't a single picture of him with her. This deeply hurts him. He feels conflicted, but ultimately decides he cannot leave Josefina alone after everything she has done for him. Later, Alexandre sneaks out at night to attend a party with his friends. There, he meets the same girl from school, and they share a kiss. Alexandre drinks too much at the party and becomes so disoriented that he cannot go home alone. His friends drop him off at Josefina's house. Josefina, worried about his condition, brings him inside and helps him clean up. While doing so, Alexandre, still intoxicated, impulsively kisses Josefina. Shocked, Josefina pushes him away and slaps him. The next day, overwhelmed with guilt, Josefina prays to God and asks for forgiveness. That morning, Alexandre packs his bags and prepares to leave. When Josefina asks him why, he replies, "I'm leaving this house." He confronts her, asking, "Why didn't you tell me that my mother came to see me and left her number?" Josefina confesses, "Because I didn't want you to leave me. I love you and can't live without you." Alexandre, silent, leaves and gets into his mother's car, leaving Josefina in tears. At first, Alexandre's mother takes him to a hotel. However, he soon realizes that his mother and stepfather don't treat him with love and care. When Alexandre suggests going out for dinner, his mother replies, "Here, take some money and get something to eat. We're not hungry." Feeling neglected, Alexandre regrets leaving Josefina and decides to return. Meanwhile, Josefina struggles emotionally. She decides to change herself to fit in and goes to a bar dressed elegantly. There, she meets a man, and they start talking. As she drinks more, she becomes disoriented. The man offers to take her home, but Josefina, in her vulnerable state, expresses a desire to stay with him. He takes her to a secluded place where they start kissing. However, Josefina soon realizes she's making a mistake and asks him to stop. But he doesn't listen. Later, Josefina is left in her house emotionally broken. Josefina somehow manages to get inside. Seeing her condition, Alexandre immediately helps her and takes care of her. Ironically, the roles have reversed. Earlier, Josefina used to bathe Alexandre, but now Alexandre is the one bathing her. Josefina, who once struggled with her feelings toward Alexandre, realizes how lost she had become. She used to pray and seek forgiveness, but after Alexandre left, she broke down and her life spiraled out of control. If she had remained a nun, none of this would have happened. But living with Alexandre, she faced emotions and desires she had never encountered before. In the end, Josefina's experiences leave her shattered. The movie ends on this tragic note. Thanks for watching this recap. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to comment below and tell me what movie or series you want me to recap next.